When we first started these programs 6 years ago, Ambassador Avner was the first speaker in the little base medrash on the other side of the building. It accommodates about 150 to 200 people. He has spoken now 4 times. The last time, of course, when he introduced his new book, The Prime Ministers, which became a sensational seller. It is now a finalist for the Jewish Book Award. After the program was over, Ambassador Avner and I had a chance to chat a little bit about the book, and I said, yeah, but give me the real story. And that's what eventually led to the program tonight. The stories that didn't make it, because of the censor, because of other reasons. Ambassador Avner, described himself that night as he was the fly on the wall when all these super critical meetings were taking place between prime ministers and presidents and world decision makers, and we have the benefit of the copious notes that he took and then redacted them into the wonderful book, The Prime Ministers. Ambassador Avner was the ambassador to the UK, to Ireland, to Australia. He has served as a special advisor, a very close advisor, to 5 prime ministers. He's a member of the Council of the Jerusalem Great Synagogue and is an advisor to the people who helped run it. It's a great pleasure for me now to introduce Ambassador Yehuda Avner.
Can you hear me? Yes. Mr. Chairman, Kod Rabbanim, Professor, Mrs. Avner, Morai, ladies and gentlemen, I do hope tonight that you will have the patience to listen to all that I have to say. And I say this because, as a general rule, we Jews are big talkers, but very bad listeners. For example, I remember in the 90s when I arrived in Australia as the ambassador there, a leader of the Jewish community came up to me and said, I'm making a reception tonight for the new Israeli ambassador. Have you met him yet? That's who I asked. The new Israeli ambassador, he said, why don't you come? And I said, but I am the new Israeli ambassador. To which he said, well, why don't you come just the same?
Why don't you come anyway?
As always, I feel I must say a word of tribute to you, Asha, and to Zali, and to the board of this great synagogue for the innovative thinking that has turned this beautiful house of worship into an expanding bastion of limud, of social togetherness and public chesed. Indeed, the very reputation of this lecture series has turned it into an important annual platform for the imparting of official views, new ideas, scintillating debate, tough questions, and occasionally, such as tonight, a bit of hot air. Now, given the sensitivity of my chosen subjects, the censor and me, chapters that didn't make it into my book, I shall have to tread very carefully for fear of saying things the censor has determined constitute a violation of national security. Those of you familiar with my book, The Prime Ministers, will agree it is a pretty hefty volume. So in retrospect, I suppose I ought to be grateful to the censor for having cut out 2 whole chapters. Otherwise, the tome would have weighed the tongue. In fact, and I say this with utter false modesty, one notable reviewer wrote, "The Prime Ministers is a very heavy book to pick up and an even harder one to put down. Now, one chapter which the sensei raised had to do with Israel's psychological warfare. I don't know if I've ever mentioned this before, but there was a time in my early years in the government when I dabbled in psychological warfare, surreptitiously feeding the foreign media with disinformation and dissimulation through a publication called the Jerusalem Intelligence Report. Now, this was a fortnightly distributed to paying subscribers from a fictional address and lavishly laced with toxic innuendos calculated to vilify the enemy. In time, the intelligence report boasted a respectable roster of subscribers, one of whom was the editor of an Indian newspaper, who was so impressed by what I was writing under an assumed name that he offered me a job. What followed was shameless bluffing, for in addition to legitimate news stories, I would systematically plant apocryphal items to confuse the enemy. One notable plant, which I sent on April Fool's Day, and which was calculated to sow suspicions in the mind of the Syrians that the Egyptians were doing deals with the Israelis behind their backs, ran as follows. I quote: "Under a flag of truce, a secret midnight meeting of Israeli and Egyptian officers took place last night at a remote level crossing in Sinai. The officers took cover when a supply truck loaded with eggs appeared from the direction of El Arish and collided with a freight train carrying butter en route from Port Said. As a result of the crash, the truck caught fire. There were no casualties, but the eggs and the butter were fried into an enormous omelette weighing more than a ton, on which the officers breakfasted before returning to their respective lives." And as I said, that lampoon was published in India as fact. Now, in private conversation, the censor told me that the subject that tickled his fancy most were the sections I'd written about my ambassadorial dealings with the British royal family. He evidently had a crush on Princess Diana. I was particularly enamored by my tale of the 1948 official visit to London of the then Prime Minister Shimon Peres, who was entertained for lunch by Princess Diana and her then husband, Prince Charles, at their Kensington Palace home. It was an informal and cozy affair. Charles, elegant in a navy blazer and regimental tie, and Diana looking ravishing in a fashionable summer outfit. Following a prelude of pleasantries, the suave and urbane Shimon Peres said with a semi-bow, "Your Royal Highnesses, I come carrying gifts from Jerusalem." And he presented to Diana a Roman coin bearing the likeness of Diana, the goddess of the hunt, and to Charles, who was an avowed horse lover, a statuette of a terracotta horse of ancient Greek provenance, both unearthed in Jerusalem. Mrs. Peres then said with great formality, "It is my privilege to extend to you an official invitation to visit Israel at a time of your convenience, where you will be received with all honor as most welcome guests." Diana's eyes sparkled, and Charles responded with a bland, "How kind!" And then, with the silkiness of his royal breeding, he nimbly qualified his acceptance with a reservation at an appropriate time. This is how it had always been with the British royal family. not one of whom has ever visited officially. Their response has always been at an appropriate time, whatever that means. At any rate, Charles, turning to the table at large, said in his Windsor top-drawer accent, "Come to think of it, I almost did visit Israel once, illegally. I was a Jordan guest of King Hussein, and I was water skiing in Aqaba Bay when suddenly my speedboat was chased by Jordanian coast guards who glared at me through a klaxon to turn around, otherwise I would be accosted by the Israeli Navy in Eilat waters. Pity you turned around, said Paris. Our coast guard would have cast a red carpet upon the waters to welcome you in." Everybody chuckled, and Diana said, "Mr. Paris, I always think of Israel as a plucky little country," to which Charles butted in to broodingly say, as if to skirt around the subject, "As for me, I find Middle Eastern politics too full of impenetrable intricacies to understand." And he added, "Do you think a day will ever come when you and your neighbors will get along?" To which Paris answered with his propensity for hyperbole and poetry, "One day we shall. But just as a bird cannot fly with one wing, and just as a man cannot applaud with one hand, so a country cannot make peace with itself alone." Quite, said Charles, seemingly befuddled. And he went on to express high praise for the menu we were eating, catered by a London kosher caterer called Chevy. Over desserts, there was much gossip about various world leaders, and it was during this chit-chat that Princess Diana leaned over to my wife and beseeched her to tell people that, contrary to what the popular tabloids were writing about her, she was not anorexic at all. "Look," she shouted, "I've just taken a second helping of pudding." Whereupon Paris asked for jovially, "Are we going to be allowed to see your children, the little princes?" Diana giggled and said, "They are such devils. William is 4 and Harry is 2, and yesterday at Buckingham Palace I let William loose in the throne room. He went running around the throne going bang, bang, bang." And most tellingly, as she said this, she was pointing her 2 fingers at her husband like a pistol. Soon, a nanny appeared with the little princes, and Diana adoringly reached out to cradle baby Harry, while William, bouncing across every barrier of protocol, began buzzing around the table pretending to be an aeroplane. My wife, Mimi, overwhelmed by her motherly instincts, planted William on her knee and softly instructed him how to say hello and goodbye in Hebrew. Thus it was that when the time came to bid farewell, the boy born to be king, the future William V, stretched out his hand to Prime Minister Paris and said to him politely, "Shalom, bye-bye." Now another story the Sansa particularly liked. Do I have any water here? Oh. Another story was when I inadvertently created a scandal at a Buckingham Palace banquet in honor of the German President Richard von Weizsäcker. The embarrassment occurred when Queen Elizabeth rose to toast her guest of honor, and all stood, except me, to the strains of the German national anthem. I say except me, because I too made as if to stand, but my legs would not carry me. They had gone numb. The Jew within me would not let me stand for that anthem. Its stanzas had been sanitized but not its tune. Its melody still echoed the Sieg Heils of Hitler's Third Reich. So there I sat glued to my chair as well, chamberlains, ladies-in-waiting and other notables with fancy titles and extravagant medals cast scandalized glances in my direction. After dinner, a towering equerry informed me that the President of Germany would like to have a private word. Von Weizsäcker was standing at the far end of the chandeliered lounge talking to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. He was a silver-haired man with a distinguished presence, made all the more imposing by the crimson sash across his chest. When the equerry announced my name, he extended his hand and said, "I just want you to know, Ambassador, I take no offense that you did not stand for my country's anthem. One cannot reverse history. Nothing of the Holocaust may ever be forgotten." His accented English rang with sincerity, expressive of the open manner he had confessed the German guilt of the Holocaust on a state visit to Israel the year before. Mrs. Thatcher had heard what he had said, remarked in a hearty, gung-ho fashion, "We should all be mighty proud that after Dunkirk and after Auschwitz, here we are standing together in friendship, you, the President of Germany, and you, the Ambassador of Israel, and me, the Prime Minister of Britain, all of us, guests of Her Majesty the Queen in Buckingham Palace, right here in Churchill's London." Now, isn't that splendid? What matters is not the past, but the future. To which the Queen's husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, who had rambled over, who hummed in his Royal Navy elocution, "Good Lord, if we were always living in the past, we'd still be fighting America." Now, here, my friends, I have to make a personal confession. Frankly, I could not stand the man. He had a perpetual provocative way about him, presumably born out of the years of boredom. After all, what exactly was his job other than to trail behind his wife at official functions, hands behind his back, making meaningless small talk? But whenever he counted me in a diplomatic lineup, where protocol prescribed I stand between the ambassadors of Iraq and Iran. That's right, you heard right, between the ambassadors of Iraq and Iran, this being the order in which we had presented our credentials. He would invariably toss out some wise-cracked remark like, "Are you three getting along yet? Or having fun together, are you? Or are you still going at each other?" And all three of us, the Iraqi, the Iranian, and me, would return him a forced smile while continuing to ignore one another with the well-drilled, habitual silence of hereditary enemies. Actually, in truth, the censor was fairly liberal in allowing me to reproduce a good many of hitherto classified transcripts and documents, which, dare I admit this, I had kept in my possession since my days in government. But where he absolutely drew the line with his fat red pencil was anything that had to do with Israel's alleged nuclear capabilities. Since it is no secret that of the many countries of the world, the Jewish state alone is repeatedly subjected to calls for its extinction, and since one of the many purposes of Iran's drive for nuclear weapons is to try to take a lucky shot at Tel Aviv, I thought I might allow myself in my writing the liberty of citing some behind-the-scenes facts concerning Israel's supposed last line of defense designed in extremis to preserve our existence. But the census said no. Meanwhile, as you know, there's recently been a flurry of reports claiming that the Mossad has been sabotaging the Iranian program with devastating effect, culminating a week or so ago in the New York Times revelation that the Mossad has deeply embedded, by stealth, the most sophisticated cyber weapon ever deployed, a virus called Stuxnet, into Iran's nuclear computer systems, thereby setting back its atomic bomb-making capacity by quite a few years. So if the experts are right, Iran has been hit by a strike as devastating, perhaps, as any military operation might have been without its attendant retaliations. Of course, we are talking here about delay, not elimination. As for Israel's own alleged nuclear capabilities, if you surf the internet, you will find substantive references to the subject. Among them, an alleged highly secret policy debate which took place in Washington during 1969, this being Richard Nixon's first year in office and Golda Meir's premiership of Israel. This eternal American debate was said to be over the alleged Israeli nuclear weapons program, and broadly speaking, the deliberations had to do with whether it was feasible, either politically or technically, for the Nixon administration to try to prevent Israel from crossing the nuclear threshold, or whether Washington should find what they called ground rules, which would allow it to live with a nuclear Israel. This debate is said to have taken place on the eve of Prime Minister Golda Meir's visit to Washington in the early fall of '69. I remember that visit well, because it coincided with Sukkot, and I had a hard time finding a sukkah between meetings. These talks between Golda and Nixon were allegedly a key event in the emergence of the nuclear understanding between the United States and Israel. According to this version, Golda pledged to maintain an overall policy of restraint with regard to possessing, note that word, possessing nuclear weapons. In other words, she supposedly undertook to pursue a policy of ambiguity regarding the existence of an Israeli nuclear program designed to produce a bomb. The Nixon White House was said to have been satisfied with this approach and ceased pressuring Israel on the matter. However, 2 weeks later, on October the 8th, so it is alleged, Henry Kissinger, then chief of the National Security Council, provided Nixon with a detailed analysis of the consequences of his understanding with Golda, most particularly on the issue of the use of that key word, possessing. So long as Israel did not actually possess the bomb, meaning that a nuclear device had not been actually assembled, Nixon told Kissinger that he was content to accept Israel's private assurances of maintaining a policy of ambiguity. Kissinger, so it is said, eventually came round to agreeing with Nixon's legalistic rationale, to the effect that, and I quote, "We have Israel's assurance that it will remain a non-nuclear state as defined in the UN Non-Proliferation Treaty." The fact is that to this day, Israel's policy continues to be one of ambiguity and opacity, meaning that if an Israeli official is asked whether Israel possesses nuclear weapons or not, he or she is required to answer, I quote, "Israel is not a nuclear power and will not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons into the Middle East." In short, we neither confirm nor deny our nuclear capability, nor are we a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement. So let us leave that subject at that. Actually, I did find on one occasion that I was embroiled in a rather awkward episode that had a sinister nuclear twist to it. I'm talking about the 1980s when I was ambassador to Britain, and the Sunday Times printed photographs allegedly depicting the inside of the Dimona nuclear plant, along with a story provided by a certain Mordechai Vanunu.
Oh my God.
Mr. Vanunu, the paper wrote, had once worked in Dimona, was fired, emigrated to Australia, converted to Christianity, and was now in Britain, where he had presented the newspaper with the incriminating evidence as an act of so-called conscience. I was later to learn that the Sunday Times forked out a fortune to acquire the stuff. A couple of weeks after that story broke, the Sunday Times carried a report that Mordechai Vanunu had gone missing. It was subsequently alleged that he had been seduced out of the country by a Mossad agent, a certain glamorous blonde going by the name of Cindy. This Cindy woman, so it was said, had used her charms to persuade Vanunu to travel with her for a holiday in Italy, from whence, so the story went, the Mossad had abducted him to Israel to stand trial for espionage and treason, as indeed he was. I, of course, knew nothing of such subterfuges. But I was nevertheless summoned to number 10 Downing Street to explain myself personally and director to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher as to what Israel was up to. Now you have to understand something. Margaret Thatcher was not called the Iron Lady for nothing. One had to tread very carefully with this madam, who by reputation allowed no interruptions, heard no excuses, and permitted no questioning. So as I was ushered into Mrs. Thatcher's presence, I, like a duck, sought to maintain an air of outer composure, while under the surface I was paddling away at my kishkis in an effort to remain dignified and unruffled. Before leaving for number 10, I had thoroughly rehearsed myself in front of my bathroom mirror as to what exactly I was going to say and the sincerity of the manner in which I was going to say it. Mrs. Thatcher immediately fired off her heavy cannon. What's this I hear, Ambassador? Your people have abducted a person from this country? How dare you? She was genuinely furious. No, madam, said I, thinking of this Cindy woman's ostensible seduction, not abduction. What do you mean, said Thatcher? Are you telling me it's not true? I am Prime Minister, said I, with as much integrity as I could muster. So what is your explanation? In response, I recited the words I had rehearsed in front of my bathroom mirror. Said I, Prime Minister, Mr. Vanunu left this country of his own volition through normal departure procedures. No British law was violated. And am I supposed to believe that, said she, as if it was all my doing? Are you telling me there was no coercion? Yes, madam, said I, and I again repeated with butterflies in my stomach. With the utmost gravitas, Mr. Vanunu left this country of his own volition through normal departure procedures. No British law was violated. If you ask me to repeat that again, I shall do so off by heart, because I learned it off by heart before I went into Mrs. Thatcher. And she, realizing I would not budge from the set assertion, bid me a brisk good night, and that was that. Now back to the sense, if I may. In the original version of my book, he did cut out a paragraph or two dealing with some very sensitive exchanges between Prime Minister Golda Meir and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger following the Yom Kippur War, but not enough to encroach upon the integrity of the narrative. And speaking of, how can our mind not make mention of the revelation publicly divulged a few weeks ago with the release of the latest batch of the Nixon Oval Office tapes, in which we hear him infamously saying to the President following a meeting he had had with Prime Minister Golda Meir, at which he had pleaded for American pressure to secure the release of more Russian Jews. We hear him, Kissinger, saying to Nixon these words: "The immigration of Jews from the Soviet Union is not an objective of American foreign policy. Were Jews put into gas chambers by the Soviet Union, this would not be an American concern. Maybe it is a humanitarian concern." End quote. How callous can a man get? Dr. Kissinger has since tried to explain away his iniquitous remark, but I doubt if he'll ever live this one down. Indeed, one is left wondering, what kind of a Jew is this man? Now, those of you who have leafed through my book might have come across some sort of an answer. It is given by a certain Professor William Fort, a Washington psychiatrist whom I befriended during my days at the embassy there. Professor William Fort, whose original name was Wilhelm Fortwackler, had grown up with Heinz, this is his German name, in the native Bavarian town of Fürth, and he had some definite views on what made them antique. I'm talking here about the mid-1970s, and we, Israel, were embroiled in a mighty blow-up with Washington, the details of which are unimportant for the moment. What is important is that we were negotiating with Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, and he was giving us a very hard time, so hard that I asked Professor Fort to give me his professional take on the man at that time. And as he did so, I made notes. And this is what he said. He said there is no separating Kissinger's personality from his policies. Though Kissinger would never admit it, ever since he'd arrived in America as a refugee in 1938 at the age of 15 and settled with his family in Washington Heights, his experiences of Nazi persecution remained locked deep inside him. He would never admit it to himself, the humiliations and the abuses which he had experienced as a teenager in Fort. This sublimation caused basic tensions in his psyche, which influenced how he perceives the world and consequently how he arrives at his decisions. Those demons of his youth will never leave him, however hard he tries to sublimate them in self-delusion. Try as he might, Fort went on, Kissinger will never be able to shed his thin Jewish refugee skin. Outwardly, as Secretary of State, said Fort, he presents an image of self-assurance, strong will and arrogance. Inwardly, however, because of his supposed emotions and his state of denial, suppressed emotions and state of denial, he is possessed of a deeply depressive disposition, an apocalyptic view of life, a tendency to paranoia, and an excessive sense of failure when things do not go his way. Persons of such a nature are invariably over-solicitous of their superiors. According to Fort, and I'm still quoting my notes, Richard Nixon is not averse to resorting to anti-Semitic barbs in Kissinger's presence. He is known to call him my Jew boy to his face, and he takes a perverse satisfaction in humiliating and taunting him with anti-Semitic slurs about how American Jews put Israel interests ahead of America's, and how they wield far too much power because of their wealth and too much influence because of their control of the media. Kissinger is careful not to bring Jewish staff members to meetings with the president for fear of arousing his anti-Semitic streak. And when it is aroused, he pretends to shrug it off, but then, back in the privacy of his room, he invariably goes into a tantrum and takes it out on his subordinates. Professor Ford rounded off his extemporaneous diagnosis with these words. Kissinger is a brilliant but disturbed man. Deep inside him is an insecure, neurotic and paranoid Jew. People like him invariably overcompensate. They go to great lengths to subdue whatever emotional bias they might feel in favor of one side and lean over backwards in favor of the other to prove they are being even-handed and objective. And that is as far as my notes go. Now back to the censor. I can verily say that the censorship of the past was far more stringent than it is today, which explains why the Prime Minister's contains a good deal of hitherto unpublished classified material. What has not radically changed, of course, are the existential threats facing Israel still, requiring us at times to take defensive measures which are often perceived abroad as unnecessarily offensive or entirely disproportionate, thereby discomforting many a fellow Jew in the eyes of his neighbours. This, of course, has happened often enough before. You will recall, for example, when Prime Minister Menachem Begin launched in 1982 war in Lebanon to eradicate the murderous PLO bases that were making life hell in Tel Aviv. And in the course of the fighting, a horrendous massacre took place at two Palestinian refugee camps near Beirut, Sabra and Shatila. Remember how the massacre was perpetrated by Lebanese Christian militias, but it was Israel which was put in the dock. And as Begin said at the time, Goyim slaughtered Goyim and they hanged the Jews. Then as now, numerous critics, many of them committed Jews, Zionists even, were quick to jump to a conclusion as to Israel's guilt. Many began to say they were getting fed up of constantly having to defend Israel's actions in face of an increasingly hostile press and souring public mood. Well, is not much the same happening today? Are we not hearing many Jews saying how weary they are getting? Weary of our actions, of our policies, of our image? Well, my friends, let me tell you something. I sometimes get weary too. And do you know what? I bet there are people in this hall tonight who also get weary at times. I sometimes get weary because my wife's sister, Esther, was killed defending Jerusalem in the 1948 War of Independence. She was 22. Our son Danny suffered injury in the 1973 Yom Kippur War. And our daughter Yael was severely injured in the 1992 Glassman that destroyed our embassy in Buenos Aires. And now we have 3 grandchildren here. So yes, I sometimes feel weary because I could not keep the promise I made to my children that the last war I had to fight would be the last of all our wars. All of us want to protect our children. And now they, our children, want to protect their own children, but they can't. In fact, their children, our grandchildren, are protecting us all. And because we know that, there are moments when you pick up the phone to call your grandkids, not for anything in particular, just to say that you love them. But as often as not, they don't answer. They don't answer because they are busy. And when they don't answer, there is that split second when you wonder what they are busy at. And you shall sometimes overcome with a sweating agony of thinking the unbearable worst. And that is a very, very wearying experience indeed. A weariness no diaspora Jew without a loved one in the IDF can possibly begin to understand. So the real question is not whether we are weary, but rather what do we do with our weariness? For surely there is a distinction between weariness and love. One can be weary without losing love. Israel has many flaws, but so does my family, and so does yours. But we love them nonetheless. So yes, there are many things that make us angry about our country, but we love it nonetheless. Is loving exhausting? Of course it is. Does it require lots of equivocation? Of course it does. Loving Israel isn't an affair. It's a deep and abiding and eternal relationship. Who among us can imagine a world without it? We have but one Jewish state. And if, God forbid, we were to lose it, then all of us, you, me, all of us, shall head into a dark and uncharted territory that I don't think any of us can begin to possibly imagine. So yes, we have to fight with all our might to protect ourselves from the gathering black clouds that are seeded by the volcanic eruptions rocking every Arab capital in our merciless and unforgiving neighborhood. Every Arab capital from Tunis to Tayman, with Cairo in between, whose end outcome we cannot possibly predict. And those among us who generally seek a two-state solution must acknowledge what the Al Jazeera documentation leaks are revealing, that no one has yet succeeded in drawing a line on the map of Eretz Israel which can satisfy our minimal security needs and the minimal Palestinian national aspirations. Maybe no such line exists, but we must keep on trying. And there is yet another front with which we have to battle with all our might. And that is the escalating, well-financed, sophisticated and mendacious international campaign to delegitimize our Jewish national identity and deprive us of our right to a national existence. And I give you my candid view that though there are some people good and true in our cabinet, on this decisive front, our government, our inflated government, with its recent performances of musical chairs that would do justice to a libretto of a Gilbert and Sullivan comic opera, this our government, with its loose cannons in and out of uniform, and with a diplomat in chief who makes a bull in a china shop look like a tame lamb, this our government is proof, if proof is needed, that this our land is governed by hashgacha more than it is by hanhaga. For our leaders are so wrapped in their own shenanigans, they are not doing nearly enough to stem the pernicious tide of intellectual assault and fascistic battering to which our religious, cultural and national integrity in this land is being daily bombarded. apropos which a while back I spoke at Oxford. And I was ferociously heckled by voices of the so-called liberal left who were yelling the vilest curses at me while making the most outrageous apologetics for the most outrageous excesses of the terrorist Islamists. Why, I wondered, was Palestine their cause, but not Sudan, Saudi Arabia, Zimbabwe, Lebanon, the Congo, or North Korea? These self-righteous so-called intellectuals seem to inhabit a subterranean world where pathological fantasies disguised as sophisticated ideas are churned out for the benefit of an ill-informed and ignorant public. Does it not remind one of the 1930s, when this underworld emerges from the depths and suddenly fascinates and captures and dominates multitudes of usually sane and responsible people who thereupon take leave of their senses and join the herd in a mindless and savage stampede? Always, these purveyors of the great lie engage in flirtations with anti-Semitic imagery. And if there is a tendency to anti-Semitism in Western culture, as there assuredly is, that the Arab style of Judeophobia, which is anti-Semitism without the West's Holocaust complex, this Judeophobia offers a truly redemptive release to many of these elites who were yelling at me in Oxford. For them to say there was no such thing as gas chambers is of course not respectable. But the same purpose is served by casting us Jews as having committed crimes much like the Nazis, as if to say, we did one, the Jews did one, and now we are evil. The consequence of this rationalization of the irrational is that our conflict on a patch of land smaller than half the size of Lake Michigan has acquired its huge explanatory power. It has become the explanation for everything that is going wrong in the Middle East, and increasingly everything that is going wrong with Europe's fast expanding Muslim population. To say that the root cause of the Israel-Palestinian conflict is what has largely stoked Islamic extremism worldwide is a very large assumption for an American president or European prime minister to make about a relatively small war compared to other wars plaguing our planet. So when leftist liberal intellectuals designate Israel as the world's only pariah state and the root cause of international terrorism, they once again ascribe to us Jews the supernatural power to cause chaos, turmoil and social injury on a worldwide scale, and that is classic anti-Semitism personified. The bigger question, though, is whether the resolution or diffusion of the Israel-Arab conflict will satisfy the jihadists who are currently saying that their wars in Chechnya, the Philippines, Indonesia, Kashmir, Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq, and their terrorist campaigns in India, Britain, France, Spain, United States, Denmark, Holland, Canada, Australia, are greatly aggravated by the Israel-Arab conflict? Or can one assume that once that conflict is diffused, they will then say, fine, fair enough, now that the root cause of our grievances have been addressed, we no longer want a theocratic empire, an international caliphate, and from now on we will go back to our regular civilian lives and peaceful pursuits. Well, you know, and I know, that this is utter balderdash. And this is why the day shall come when history shall judge these anti-Israel Western elites harshly, for they would have gazed upon the face of a global terrorist and fascist jihadist movement and perversely cheered it along, a movement that would happily slaughter them if it would serve their purpose. And by them, politicians and the campus firebrands and the shallow folk molders and the ignorant trade unionists and the sanctimonious human rights preachers and the uninformed church councils and the supermarket shelf stackers and the ill-informed professors and yes, our own post-Zionist and anti-Zionist intellectuals, some of whom occupy prominent chairs on our campuses, they who would turn the Jewish state into a binational state, they who have lost touch with our people's most cherished convictions, they who under the spurious cloak of academic freedom poison young minds, they whose very place on our university campuses is of questionable merit indeed. So in conclusion, we're left with the question, what are we to do? And I humbly offer you 10 commandments. 1. When an enemy of our people says he seeks to destroy us, believe him. 2. Be forever ready to face and crush whatever threat looms and whatever the sacrifice. 3. Stand tall in the knowledge that every tyrant in history who has sought our destruction has himself been destroyed. 4. When a Jew anywhere is threatened or attacked, do all in your power to come to his aid. 5. Never pause to wonder what the world will think or say when rushing to the aid of a fellow Jew. 6. Protect Jewish dignity and honor at all costs. Life is holy, but there are times when one must risk life for the sake of life itself. 7. Stand united in face of the enemy and never ever raise a hand against a fellow Jew, no matter the provocation. 8. Give the enemy no quarter in demolishing his malicious propaganda. 9. Be forever loyal to the historic truth that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people and Jerusalem its eternal capital. And the 10, Ushanantem levanecha, teach every Jewish child to be a proud Jew, not by accident of birth, but by the conviction of our eternal faith. My friends, earlier this week, I visited President Shimon Peres, who, as we know, was sitting shiva for his wife Sonia. With him, when I entered his parlor, were his grandson, along with Yitzhak Navon, our former president, Natan Sharansky, chairman of the Jewish Agency, and a Gero Chassid by the name of Prager, whom Peres seemed to know well. It was a poignant half-hour, a time filled with shared memories and thoughts of the day. When I exited into the reception hall, where people were waiting to be ushered in to pay their respects, I saw in the corner a bent old man accompanied by a strapping young man, a soldier. And judging by the familiarity of their behavior, I gathered they were a grandfather and a grandson. They were deep in conversation when suddenly, for whatever reason, the old man rolled up his sleeve to show the young man his Auschwitz serial number tattooed on his arm. And the soldier undid the top button of his uniform to show the old man his IDF serial number strung around his neck. And there they stood, grandfather and grandson, Auschwitz and Tzva Israel. And seeing them comparing those numbers in that place, the presidential residence, I thought to transformation from the darkest pit to the highest peak. A peak from which, the Siyata Dishmaya, we shall never ever descend again. Thank you.
The first volume of the Steinsaltz Talmud. It's titled Bracha, as you well know, because the bracha that we wish to you is good health, avichat yomim, and to continue to be able to labor in the vineyard of the Lord. I would like to read the in recognition of your outstanding service as council member and valued advisor of the Jerusalem Great Synagogue, for your dedication and leadership, and the recognition of your love of Torah and continued study, and in recognition of your outstanding service to the land, the people, and the state of Israel, and the Jewish communities throughout the world. The officers, board, council, members, and congregants proudly present you with the Steinberg edition of the Talmud, which we hope you will enjoy studying in good health and with continued success in all the things you do and of your endeavors, and for many more years. You'll have to figure out where you put the 27 volumes. We thank you for coming, and always it's an inspiring event to listen to Ambassador there. Wednesday night we begin with the Barcelona lectures by a great
I wanted to ask him a question. You can go and ask him.
Better catch him.
Do me a favor, send a copy of the tape.